What happens when trust shatters? Serena thought her secrets were safe, but Aaron was always watching. Hidden betrayals, stolen moments, and a sinister plan. This family's perfect life is unraveling. Who's lying, who's hurting, and who will come out unscathed? Stay tuned to uncover the shocking truth. Aaron Fletcher leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers in the fireplace. The crackling sound filled the quiet living room, but his thoughts were louder. Serena was late again. It was the third time this week she'd come home past midnight, each time armed with a different excuse. "Work's been crazy," she'd say with a tired smile, but tonight, even that weak explanation didn't come. She hadn't even called. Tommy sat across the room, headphones on, lost in the world of his favorite video game. Aaron watched his son, wondering how much of the tension Tommy could sense. He hated to admit it, but their family felt like a ship taking on water, slowly sinking under the weight of unspoken truths. The once warm atmosphere had grown cold, and Aaron couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound of Serena's car pulling into the driveway snapped Aaron out of his thoughts. The clock on the mantel read 11:47 p.m. Moments later, the front door creaked open and Serena stepped inside, her coat slung over one arm, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She froze when she saw Aaron waiting for her. "You're up late," she said, her voice carefully neutral. She avoided his eyes, busying herself by hanging up her coat. "So are you," Aaron replied evenly, leaning forward. "Late meeting?" She nodded, her smile too quick, too rehearsed. "Yeah, sorry, it ran over and I lost track of time." Aaron studied her for a moment, noting the faint smudge of lipstick on her collar and the nervous way she clutched her phone. He wanted to ask more but stopped himself. Confrontation now would get him nowhere. Instead, he simply nodded, his silence heavy with unspoken suspicion. Serena moved toward the stairs, pausing briefly. "I'm exhausted. Let's talk in the morning, okay?" "Sure," Aaron said softly, watching her retreat up the stairs. As her footsteps faded, he turned his attention back to the fireplace, his mind churning. Something wasn't right, and it wasn't just her late nights or vague excuses. It was the way she avoided him now, the way she dodged his gaze as if he were the problem. The next morning at breakfast, Aaron sipped his coffee while Serena fussed over her phone. Tommy sat quietly, shoving cereal into his mouth, the clink of the spoon against the bowl the only sound in the room. Aaron decided to test the waters. "Big plans for today?" he asked casually, keeping his tone light. Serena glanced up, startled. "Just the usual work stuff," she said quickly. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious." He smiled, masking the unease brewing inside him. "You've been so busy lately. Thought maybe there was something exciting going on." Her laugh was forced, and she quickly returned her attention to her phone. Aaron noticed the small, nervous habit she'd developed, her fingers tapping the edge of the table as if she were counting down to something. Later that evening, Aaron walked past Serena's office, her muffled voice drawing his attention. He paused, pressing his ear to the door. "Yeah, no, he doesn't suspect anything," she said in a hushed tone. "I'll be there tomorrow, same time." Aaron's heart dropped. He stepped away from the door, careful not to make a sound. The weight of those words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, he felt the cracks in their marriage widening into fractures. When Serena emerged from the office, her smile was as bright as ever, but Aaron saw it now for what it was, a mask. That night, as he lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, the pieces began to fall into place. He didn't have proof yet, but he had enough to know that someone was driving a wedge into their lives. And he was going to find out who. The morning was crisp, the Montana sky an unbroken stretch of pale blue. Aaron Fletcher walked into Whispering Beans, the town's favorite cafe. The familiar chime of the bell above the door greeted him, along with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Caroline Evans, the owner, stood behind the counter arranging pastries in the glass case. "Morning, Aaron," she called out, her warm smile lighting up the room. But as Aaron approached, she noticed the furrow in his brow. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Aaron lied, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. "Just needed a change of scenery, and maybe some strong coffee." Caroline raised an eyebrow but said nothing, handing him a steaming cup. "It's on the house today," she said, her tone gentle. Sit anywhere. Aaron chose a corner table by the window, his eyes scanning the room absently. The cafe was quiet, save for the murmur of conversation between two elderly regulars and the hiss of the espresso machine. He stared into his cup, his mind replaying Serena's late-night call from the night before. He doesn't suspect anything. The words gnawed at him, each syllable a hammer strike to his trust. Caroline approached, wiping her hands on a towel. "You're not your usual self," she said, sitting across from him. "Want to talk about it?" Aaron hesitated. Caroline had been a friend for years, someone who knew the quiet rhythms of the town better than anyone. If anyone might have noticed something unusual, it was her. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Have you ever seen Serena here?" he asked carefully. Caroline's expression shifted, her usual warmth replaced by something more guarded. She glanced around the cafe as if ensuring they were alone. "Aaron, I wasn't going to say anything, but yes, a few times actually." Aaron's stomach tightened. "When?" "A few afternoons last month," Caroline replied, her voice soft. "She was with a man. I didn't recognize him, but they were sitting in that corner over there." She nodded toward a secluded booth. "They seemed close." The words hit Aaron like a punch to the gut. He struggled to maintain his composure, gripping his coffee cup so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Did you hear anything they said?" he asked, his voice taut. Caroline shook her head. "No, I didn't want to pry, but they were laughing, and it didn't seem like a business meeting." Aaron's mind raced, piecing together fragments of what he knew. Serena's absences, her guarded demeanor, the phone call, and now this. 1,000 questions swirled in his head, but one stood out. Who was this man? "Thanks, Caroline," he said, standing abruptly. "I need to go." "Aaron," she called after him, her tone laced with concern. "If you ever need to talk." He nodded but didn't look back, pushing the door open with a force that startled the chime. Outside, the cold air bit at his face, but he barely noticed. His heart was pounding, his thoughts a chaotic mess. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Back home, Tommy was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as Aaron walked in, sensing his father's agitation. "Everything okay?" Tommy asked hesitantly. Aaron forced a smile. "Yeah, just a long morning." Tommy tilted his head, his expression curious but unsure. "You know, Mom's been acting weird lately, like super distracted." Aaron froze, his breath catching. "What do you mean?" Tommy shrugged. "I don't know. She's always on her phone, and she hides it if I walk by. Yesterday I saw her looking at some picture of a guy, but she closed it before I could see who it was." Aaron's chest tightened, another piece of the puzzle. "Did she say anything about it?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "No," Tommy replied, shaking his head. "But she looked, I don't know, nervous maybe." Aaron nodded slowly, his mind racing. He needed more information, something concrete. For now, he couldn't let Tommy see how deeply this was affecting him. "Thanks, kiddo," he said, ruffling Tommy's hair. "Let me know if you notice anything else." Tommy gave a small smile, though the concern lingered in his eyes. Aaron retreated to his room, closing the door behind him. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out his phone. If Serena thought he didn't suspect anything, she was wrong. Whatever secrets she was keeping, Aaron was determined to uncover them, no matter what it took. Aaron's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he parked his truck across the street from Pinewood Inn. The neon vacancy sign flickered in the evening gloom, casting an eerie glow over the gravel lot. From his vantage point, Aaron had a clear view of the entrance. He leaned forward, his breath fogging the windshield, scanning for Serena. His chest felt heavy, the weight of uncertainty pressing harder with every passing minute. Then he saw her. Serena's car pulled into the lot, her movements quick and deliberate. She stepped out, glancing over her shoulder as if checking for anyone watching. Aaron's heart sank. This wasn't the behavior of someone on a business meeting. She smoothed her coat and walked toward the entrance, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Moments later, a man emerged from the shadows. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a confident stride. He greeted Serena with a brief smile, and she responded with a nervous laugh. Aaron squinted, trying to make out the man's face. His blood boiled as the two exchanged what looked like a familiar, almost intimate embrace. The man led Serena inside, holding the door open for her. Aaron sat frozen, every fiber of his being screaming to follow, but he stayed put. He couldn't risk being seen. Not yet. Instead, he pulled out his phone and snapped a photo of the man just as the door swung shut. Minutes passed like hours. Aaron's mind raced, replaying every conversation he'd had with Serena over the past few months. The late nights, the phone calls, the vague excuses. It all pointed to this moment. He felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner. The door opened again, and Aaron's pulse quickened. The man stepped out alone, a folder clutched under his arm. He lit a cigarette and stood under the flickering neon light, his expression cold and calculating. Aaron noted the man's posture, relaxed, confident, but with an edge that suggested he wasn't to be underestimated. As the man got into a sleek black car and drove away, Aaron's eyes darted back to the inn. Serena hadn't come out yet. He debated whether to wait or confront her inside, but decided against it. He needed to gather more information before taking any action. If Serena was hiding something, he'd uncover it piece by piece. Back at home, the house was quiet. Tommy was upstairs, likely playing his video games, oblivious to the turmoil swirling below. Aaron poured himself a glass of water, his hands trembling slightly as he replayed the events of the evening. He stared at the photo on his phone, zooming in on the man's face. Something about him seemed familiar, but Aaron couldn't place it. He saved the photo to a private folder and sat at the kitchen table, his thoughts a whirlwind. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped him back to the present. He stood as Serena entered the house, her coat folded neatly over her arm. She froze when she saw him waiting. "You're up late," she said, her voice light, but her eyes betrayed her unease. "Couldn't sleep," Aaron replied, his tone carefully neutral. "How was your meeting?" Serena hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough for Aaron to notice. "Fine. Just catching up with an old colleague." Aaron nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Must have been important to run this late." Serena smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You know how it is. Work can get demanding." "Of course," Aaron said, his voice calm despite the storm raging inside him. "I'm sure it was worth it." She muttered something about being tired and headed upstairs, her steps quick, as if trying to escape his presence. Aaron watched her go, his jaw clenched. He knew she was lying. He just didn't know why. That night, Aaron lay awake, the image of Serena and the man at Pinewood Inn burned into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of a cliff, and the ground beneath him was beginning to crumble. He resolved that whatever secrets Serena was keeping, he would uncover them, no matter how deep he had to dig. The faint hum of the hidden camera blended with the quiet of the house. Aaron adjusted the angle of the small device tucked neatly behind the family bookshelf. It had taken him all night to set up, ensuring it wouldn't be noticed by anyone, especially Serena. His hands trembled slightly as he positioned the lens to face the living room where she often made her late-night calls. He wasn't proud of what he was doing, but after what he'd seen at Pinewood Inn, Aaron felt like he had no choice. Trust had already been broken. All he wanted now was the truth. The next evening, Aaron pretended to head to bed early. He kissed Tommy goodnight, ruffled his hair, and then retreated to his room, leaving the lights off and the door slightly ajar. From his phone, he accessed the live feed from the hidden camera, the image sharp and clear. The minutes ticked by in tense silence until finally Serena appeared in the living room. She glanced over her shoulder, ensuring she was alone, and sat down on the couch, phone in hand. Aaron held his breath as she dialed a number, her voice low but audible. "Ethan, it's me." Aaron's stomach twisted at the sound of the name. He pressed the volume higher, his heart pounding in his chest. "No, he doesn't suspect anything," Serena continued, her tone tinged with nervousness. "I think I can transfer the funds tomorrow. But we have to be careful. He's not stupid, Ethan. If he figures this out—" Her voice trailed off, replaced by a heavy sigh. Aaron gripped his phone tighter, every word like a blade cutting into him. Funds? Transfer? What was she talking about? And why was Ethan still in the picture? Serena ended the call a few minutes later, pacing the living room with her arms crossed. Aaron could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. She looked conflicted, torn between guilt and whatever plan she was concocting with Ethan. When she finally turned off the lights and went upstairs, Aaron stayed behind in the dark, staring at the frozen image on his screen. The woman in the video was a stranger to him. Or maybe he'd just been too blind to see this side of her all along. Either way, he knew he couldn't confront her yet, not without understanding the full scope of what she was hiding. The next day, Aaron reviewed the footage again while Tommy was at school. His son had become quieter lately, more withdrawn. Aaron couldn't tell if Tommy was noticing the tension between his parents, or if something else was weighing on him. Either way, Aaron resolved to shield him from the storm brewing beneath their roof. Later that afternoon, while cleaning up Tommy's room, Aaron noticed a crumpled piece of paper sticking out of his son's backpack. Curious, he unfolded it and froze. It was a handwritten note. Pinewood Inn, 7 p.m. The handwriting wasn't Serena's, but the connection was undeniable. Aaron felt his throat tighten. Why would Tommy have this? Did he know something? Or worse, had Serena been careless enough to leave evidence behind? He tucked the note into his pocket, a fresh wave of suspicion coursing through him. By evening, Aaron had returned to his silent observation. Serena was distant during dinner, offering one-word responses to Tommy's attempts at conversation. When Aaron asked how her day was, she smiled too brightly and said, "Busy as usual." The tension between them was palpable, a silent war of unspoken truths. That night, Aaron replayed the footage one more time, focusing on Serena's expressions. There were moments where she seemed almost regretful, her eyes distant and unfocused. But was it regret over her actions, or fear of being caught? As he closed his laptop, Aaron felt the walls of their marriage closing in. Secrets had taken root, twisting their once solid foundation into something unrecognizable. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the lies or the possibility that the woman he loved was willing to destroy everything they'd built together. Whatever the case, Aaron promised himself one thing: he wouldn't let her rip their family apart, not without a fight. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, but the warmth did little to thaw the icy silence between Aaron and Serena. Aaron sat at the table, his hands clasped around a mug of lukewarm coffee. Across from him, Serena picked at her toast, her gaze fixed on her phone. "Anything exciting happening today?" Aaron asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Serena didn't look up. "Just work," she replied quickly. "Why?" Aaron shrugged. "No reason, just curious how busy you've been lately." Serena finally met his gaze, her brow furrowing slightly. "I've told you, Aaron, things are hectic right now. Do we really have to do this every morning?" "Do what?" Aaron said, his voice even. "Talk like a normal couple?" Serena set her phone down with a loud clink, her patience clearly wearing thin. "I'm doing my best, Aaron. Sorry if that's not enough for you." Aaron leaned back in his chair, his expression calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "Are you really?" he asked softly, his words cutting through the room like a blade. The tension snapped like a rubber band. "What is that supposed to mean?" Serena demanded, her voice rising. "You've been acting strange for weeks, Aaron. Do you think I don't notice?" "I could say the same about you," Aaron replied, his tone cool but firm. "Late nights, secretive phone calls, always on edge. Should I not notice that?" Serena's face flushed with anger, but there was something else in her eyes, something that looked a lot like fear. "I can't believe you're accusing me of whatever it is you think I'm doing. I've been working my ass off for this family, Aaron." Aaron slammed his mug down on the table, the sound making Serena flinch. "Don't insult me by pretending this is about work," he snapped. "You're hiding something, Serena, and I'm tired of pretending I don't see it." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the kitchen clock. Then Serena stood abruptly, grabbing her phone and purse. "I don't have to listen to this," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm late for a meeting." Aaron didn't stop her as she stormed out the door. He sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. He hadn't meant for things to escalate so quickly, but the pressure of keeping everything bottled up had finally broken him. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Serena's reaction had been more than just anger. It had been panic. Upstairs, Tommy heard the muffled argument through his bedroom door. He stepped out cautiously, finding Aaron sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at the door Serena had just slammed. "Dad?" Tommy asked hesitantly. "What's going on?" Aaron looked up, his expression softening when he saw his son. "Nothing you need to worry about, buddy," he said, trying to muster a reassuring smile. "Just grown-up stuff." Tommy lingered, his eyes filled with questions he didn't know how to ask. "Mom's been weird lately," he said finally. "Like, really weird." Aaron sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "She has." Tommy took a seat at the table, fiddling with the corner of his sleeve. "Do you think she's okay?" "I don't know," Aaron said honestly, "but I promise you, whatever's going on, we'll figure it out, together." Tommy nodded, though the uncertainty in his eyes didn't fade. Aaron reached across the table, squeezing his son's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it was all he could offer. Later that evening, Serena returned home, her expression guarded. Aaron didn't say anything as she walked past him into the kitchen. The tension from the morning still hung thick in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Tommy watched the exchange from the staircase, his young face etched with worry. Aaron decided to wait. He had pushed too hard earlier and he needed a different approach. But as he watched Serena avoid his gaze, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever she was hiding, it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Aaron sat in his truck, the envelope clutched tightly in his hands. The air inside felt thick, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his chest. The envelope had arrived that morning. A plain, unmarked package slid under his front door. Inside were documents, old police reports, financial statements, and photos of a man he now recognized all too well, Ethan Caldwell. His hands trembled as he flipped through the papers. Ethan had a history, fraud, manipulation, leaving a trail of broken lives in his wake. But it wasn't until Aaron reached the final page that the pieces truly fell into place. A woman's name was scrawled in neat handwriting. Mia Thompson. Beneath it, a phone number. Aaron didn't hesitate. He dialed the number, his pulse quickening with every ring. On the third ring, a woman's voice answered, wary and tired. "Hello?" "Mia Thompson," Aaron asked, his voice steady but firm. "My name is Aaron Fletcher. I think we need to talk about Ethan Caldwell." There was a long pause, then a sigh. "What's he done now?" Within the hour, Aaron found himself sitting across from Mia in a quiet corner of a diner on the edge of town. She was younger than he expected, her eyes carrying a sadness that seemed far older than her years. As she stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, she began to tell her story. "I met Ethan 3 years ago," Mia said, her voice soft but tinged with bitterness. "He was charming, successful, or at least he seemed that way. It didn't take long before he convinced me to invest in one of his business ventures, promised me it was a sure thing. I lost everything." Aaron leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "What happened after that?" "He disappeared," Mia continued, her eyes clouding with pain. "Left me with nothing but debt and a pile of lies. I tried to go to the police, but Ethan's smart. He covers his tracks. By the time I realized what he'd done, it was too late." Aaron sat back, the weight of her words settling in his chest. "He's involved with my wife," he said, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "I think they're planning something big." Mia's eyes widened and she leaned closer. "If Ethan's targeting your family, you need to be careful. He doesn't just take money, he destroys everything. Relationships, trust. He thrives on it." Aaron nodded, his mind racing. "Do you have anything I can use? Proof of what he's done?" Mia hesitated for a moment before reaching into her bag. She pulled out a small USB drive and slid it across the table. "It's not much," she said. "Just some emails and messages he sent me. But maybe it'll help." Aaron took the drive, gripping it tightly. "Thank you." Mia placed a hand on his arm, her voice softening. "Be careful, Aaron. Ethan's dangerous. And if your wife's caught up with him, she might not be the person you think she is." Her words lingered in Aaron's mind long after he left the diner. Back home, he plugged the USB drive into his laptop, the screen illuminating a series of damning messages. Ethan's charm was evident in every word, but so was his cruelty. He played on vulnerabilities, exploiting weaknesses until there was nothing left. And now, Aaron realized, Ethan was doing the same to Serena. That evening, Aaron sat at the kitchen table, the documents spread out before him. Serena walked in, her steps hesitant when she saw him. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Aaron looked up, his expression calm but unreadable. "Just doing some research," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Serena lingered for a moment before retreating to the living room, her phone in hand. Aaron watched her go, his resolve hardening. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he had enough to know one thing for certain. This wasn't just about his marriage anymore. It was about protecting his family, no matter what it took. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but for Serena, each second felt like an eternity. She sat in the dimly lit corner of Pinewood Inn's lounge, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of her glass. Ethan was late. The anxiety pooling in her chest felt heavier than usual, an unrelenting weight that made her hands tremble. When Ethan finally arrived, his polished demeanor barely concealed the edge of impatience in his stride. He slid into the seat across from her, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're jumpy tonight," he remarked, his tone teasing but sharp. "Is something wrong?" Serena forced a laugh, shaking her head. "No, it's just, Aaron's been asking more questions lately. I think he's starting to notice." Ethan leaned back, folding his arms. "And? That's not a problem as long as you stick to the plan." Serena hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not that simple. He's careful, observant. If he figures out what we're doing—" "Stop," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. He leaned forward, lowering his tone but keeping the intensity. "You're overthinking. We've been through this. Once the money is in my account, we're gone. He won't even have time to realize what's happened." Serena nodded, but the unease in her chest remained. "I need more time. Aaron's been checking the accounts lately, and I can't move that much money without raising suspicion." Ethan's expression hardened, his usual charm slipping away. "Time is the one thing we don't have, Serena. You said you'd handle this." "I will," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. I need to make sure Tommy's okay before we leave. I can't—" Ethan slammed his hand on the table, silencing her. The sound was loud enough to draw a glance from a nearby server, but he didn't care. "Tommy will be fine. This isn't about him, Serena. It's about us." Serena flinched at the sharpness in his tone. For the first time, she saw a side of Ethan that unsettled her, a side that cared little for the consequences, as long as he got what he wanted. The doubt that had been whispering in the back of her mind grew louder. Back at home, Aaron sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open and the USB drive plugged in. The messages on the screen painted a clear picture of Ethan's manipulation, a web of lies spun with precision to ensnare his victims. Every word dripped with calculated intent, and Aaron could see how Serena had been drawn into his trap. But knowing wasn't enough. Aaron needed to act. He spent the next hour carefully freezing the joint account Serena had access to, rerouting funds to a separate account only he could control. If Ethan thought he could waltz in and steal from his family, he was in for a rude awakening. When Serena returned home later that night, she found Aaron in the living room pretending to read a book. She paused in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the light from the hallway. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Aaron looked up, offering a small smile. "Couldn't sleep." She nodded, lingering for a moment before heading upstairs. Aaron waited until he heard the bedroom door close before pulling out his phone. He scrolled through the live footage from the hidden camera, watching as Serena entered the room, placed her phone on the nightstand, and sat on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. Aaron's jaw tightened. Whatever guilt Serena felt, it wasn't enough to stop her from going through with Ethan's plan. But she didn't know that Aaron had plans of his own. The next morning, Serena stood by the kitchen counter, scrolling through her banking app. Aaron watched her carefully from across the room, sipping his coffee. When she froze, her eyes widening in panic, he knew she'd discovered the frozen accounts. "Something wrong?" he asked casually. Serena turned, forcing a tight smile. No, just a glitch in the app, I think. Aaron nodded, hiding his satisfaction. Happens all the time. As Serena left the room, Aaron's expression darkened. He didn't know how far Serena was willing to go for Ethan, but one thing was certain, this game was far from over. Tommy leaned against the tree at the edge of the park, the crisp autumn breeze tugging at his jacket. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands clammy with nervous anticipation. He'd seen his mom's car parked across the lot, and he knew exactly who she was meeting. His legs itched to turn back, to leave and pretend he hadn't noticed, but something inside him refused to let go. He needed answers. Across the clearing, Serena sat on a bench, her posture stiff. Ethan stood in front of her, speaking in low tones that Tommy couldn't quite make out. From his vantage point, Tommy could see her expression, nervous, almost apologetic. She nodded at something Ethan said, glancing around as if worried someone might see them. The scene felt surreal, like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Tommy had always known his mom could be distant, but this was different. This was wrong. Unable to watch any longer, Tommy stepped out from behind the tree. His footsteps crunched against the gravel path, catching Serena's attention. She turned sharply, her eyes widening when she saw him. "Tommy?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She rose quickly, stepping toward him. "What are you doing here?" "I should be asking you that," Tommy replied, his tone sharper than he intended. His gaze shifted to Ethan, who stood there watching with a cold, detached expression. "Who's he?" Serena glanced back at Ethan, then at her son, panic flickering across her face. "Tommy, this isn't what it looks like. I can explain." "Really?" Tommy's voice cracked, the weight of his emotions breaking through. "Because it looks like you're lying to Dad. It looks like you're betraying us." Ethan took a step forward, his calm demeanor unsettling. "Maybe this isn't the time for family drama," he said smoothly. "We should talk later, Serena." Tommy's fists clenched at Ethan's words. "You don't get to talk to her," he snapped. "You don't belong here." "Tommy!" Serena exclaimed, her voice trembling. She turned to Ethan. "Go! Just go!" Ethan hesitated, his gaze lingering on Tommy for a moment before he shrugged and walked away. The air felt heavier as silence fell between mother and son, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. "Tommy, listen to me," Serena began, reaching for his arm. But Tommy pulled away, his eyes filled with anger and hurt. "How could you?" he demanded, his voice cracking again. "How could you do this to Dad, to us?" "It's not what you think," Serena pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "I never meant for this to happen." "Then what is it?" Tommy shouted. "Because it sure looks like you're trying to ruin everything. Do you even care about me, about Dad?" "Of course I care!" Serena's voice broke, her tears spilling over. "I love you and your father. I just..." Tommy shook his head, his face a mixture of anger and despair. "You don't get to say that. Not after this." He turned and began walking away, his steps quick and unsteady. "Tommy, wait!" Serena called after him, her voice cracking, but he didn't stop. When Tommy finally reached home, he found Aaron sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him. The sight of his dad's calm expression only made the pain in Tommy's chest ache more. Aaron looked up, concern flickering in his eyes. "Tommy, you okay?" Tommy hesitated, his lips trembling as he tried to find the words. Finally he spoke. "I saw her, Dad. I saw Mom. With him." Aaron froze, his breath catching. "What?" Tommy sat down, his shoulders slumping. "She was with that guy. The one from the pictures. I don't know what to do." Aaron reached across the table, placing a steady hand on his son's. "It's okay," he said softly. "We'll figure it out, together." Tommy nodded, but the tears brimming in his eyes betrayed his pain. Aaron's grip tightened, his resolve solidifying. He wouldn't let Ethan destroy his family, not without a fight. The dining table was set meticulously, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. Aaron had chosen every detail carefully. The silverware, the lighting, even the faint scent of lavender wafting through the room. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a stage. And tonight, the curtain was about to rise. Serena entered the room, her expression wary. She glanced at the table, her gaze lingering on the candles flickering softly. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice cautious. "A special dinner," Aaron said smoothly, pulling out a chair for her. "I thought we could use a night to reconnect." Serena hesitated, but eventually sat down. She looked beautiful, but Aaron couldn't ignore the tension in her shoulders or the way her fingers nervously played with the hem of her dress. She wasn't relaxed. She was bracing herself. "I wanted us to have a moment to talk," Aaron continued, pouring her a glass of wine. "Clear the air." Serena gave a tight smile, her eyes flicking toward the hallway. "Where's Tommy?" "With a friend for the night," Aaron replied, keeping his tone light. "It's just us." Before Serena could respond, the doorbell rang. Her head snapped toward the sound, her face paling slightly. "Are we expecting someone?" she asked, her voice edged with unease. Aaron stood, his expression calm. "I invited a guest. Someone I thought you'd like to see." Serena froze, her grip tightening around her wine glass. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. A moment later, Aaron returned with Ethan in tow. The man's usual confident swagger seemed slightly diminished as he stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the space warily. "Ethan," Aaron said, gesturing to the empty chair. "Glad you could join us." Serena's voice was barely a whisper. "Aaron, what is this?" Aaron smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "A chance, to be honest, for all of us." Ethan sat down reluctantly, his posture stiff. Serena looked between the two men, panic flickering across her face. "I don't understand." "Then let me help," Aaron interrupted, his tone sharpening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table toward Ethan. "Does this look familiar?" Ethan's jaw tightened as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. Bank statements, emails, photos, each piece of evidence meticulously gathered and laid bare. Aaron leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Serena. "I've known for weeks, the late nights, the phone calls, the money transfers. I know everything, Serena." Her face crumpled, tears pooling in her eyes. "Aaron, I can explain." "Save it," Aaron snapped, his voice like a whip. "This isn't just about you, this is about what you've done to this family." Ethan, finally finding his voice, smirked. "So you brought me here to play judge and jury? What's next, punishment?" Aaron's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to talk about consequences, Ethan, not after what you've done." Ethan leaned forward, his smirk fading. "Careful, Aaron. You think you're in control here, but you're not. People like me, we don't lose." Aaron's expression hardened. "You already have. The accounts are frozen. The authorities have everything they need. Your little scheme? It's over." Ethan's face twisted in fury, but before he could respond, Serena spoke, her voice breaking. "Ethan, you said this wouldn't happen." Ethan laughed bitterly. "And you believed me? You're as naive as I thought." Serena flinched, the weight of his words crushing what little resolve she had left. She turned to Aaron, her tears flowing freely now. "I made a mistake. I'm sorry." Aaron stood, his voice steady but cold. "Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't undo what you've done." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint crackle of the candles. Ethan, realizing he had no way out, stood abruptly. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and venomous before storming out of the house. Serena collapsed into her chair, her sobs racking her frame. Aaron didn't move, his eyes hard and unyielding. The man he had been, the trusting, loving husband, was gone. In his place stood someone forged by betrayal, someone who wouldn't break so easily again. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock in the living room. Serena sat on the couch, her face buried in her hands, tears streaming through her fingers. The weight of the evening pressed down on her like an anchor, every word from Aaron and Ethan replaying in her mind. The room felt suffocating, its walls seeming to close in, trapping her with the consequences of her choices. Aaron stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His jaw was clenched and his eyes stared blankly at the flickering flames. He hadn't said a word since Ethan stormed out, and the silence between them was heavier than any argument. Finally, Serena spoke, her voice trembling. "Aaron, please, say something." Aaron turned his gaze to her, his eyes cold and unreadable. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his tone sharp but steady. "That I forgive you, that everything's fine? Because it's not, Serena. It's far from fine." She flinched, her tears flowing harder. "I was stupid. I was lost. Ethan, he made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time." Aaron laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "And that justifies betraying me? Betraying Tommy? You didn't just hurt me, Serena. You put our family at risk. For what? A fantasy? A con man's lies?" Serena sobbed, her hands clutching at the fabric of her dress. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you." Aaron's voice rose, his anger finally breaking through. "But you did! You didn't think about me or Tommy or anyone else. You only thought about yourself." Her breath hitched, and for a moment she couldn't respond. The truth in his words cut deeper than anything Ethan had ever said to her. Upstairs, Tommy sat on his bed, his knees drawn to his chest. He could hear the faint sound of their voices, but he couldn't make out the words. His heart ached, the events of the past few days swirling in his mind. He felt betrayed, not just by his mom's actions, but by the realization that the foundation of their family had been a lie. Back downstairs, Serena took a shaky breath and met Aaron's eyes. "What do I have to do to fix this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll do anything." Aaron's expression didn't soften. "I don't know if you can. Trust isn't something you just rebuild overnight, Serena. It takes time. It takes work. And right now, I don't know if I have anything left to give." Serena's shoulders slumped, her body shaking with silent sobs. She had never seen Aaron like this, so cold, so distant. It terrified her. Aaron turned away from her, running a hand through his hair. His mind was a storm of emotions, anger, sadness, betrayal. But above it all was the crushing weight of uncertainty. Could he ever trust her again? Could he look at her without seeing Ethan's shadow looming between them? "I need time," he said finally, his voice flat. "I can't do this right now." Serena nodded slowly, wiping her face with trembling hands. "I understand," she said softly. "I'll give you space. Just, please don't give up on us." Aaron didn't respond. He walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her guilt. That night, as Aaron lay awake in the guest room staring at the ceiling, he thought about Tommy. His son had been caught in the crossfire of something he didn't deserve, and Aaron felt a surge of guilt for not shielding him better. Tomorrow, he decided, would be about Tommy. If nothing else, Aaron knew he had to be there for his son. The morning light filtered weakly through the blinds in the guest room. Aaron lay motionless, the ceiling a blur as his thoughts churned endlessly. Sleep had been elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Serena's tear-streaked face, heard her broken apologies, yet her words felt hollow, unable to reach the part of him that had been shattered. A knock at the door startled him. Tommy's voice followed, hesitant. "Dad, can I come in?" "Yeah," Aaron replied, sitting up and rubbing his face. Tommy stepped in, his hands stuffed into his hoodie pocket, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Are you okay?" Tommy asked, his voice quiet. Aaron sighed, motioning for Tommy to sit beside him. "I should be asking you that," he said. "I know this hasn't been easy for you." Tommy sat down, his expression conflicted. I don't get it. Why would she do this? Why would she—" His voice cracked and he looked away, blinking rapidly. Aaron placed a hand on his son's shoulder, the weight of the moment pressing hard on both of them. "I don't have all the answers, Tommy," he admitted. "But I know she loves you. Whatever mistake she's made, that hasn't changed." Tommy shook his head, his frustration bubbling over. "How do you know that? How can you even look at her after what she's done?" Aaron hesitated, his own anger and pain threatening to surface. "Because she's still your mom," he said finally. "And because sometimes people make terrible choices. That doesn't mean they stop caring about the people they hurt." Tommy didn't respond. He just sat there, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Finally, he stood, his movements stiff. "I need some air." Aaron watched as his son left the room, the door clicking softly behind him. He felt helpless, the weight of his failure as a father pressing down on him. He had promised to protect Tommy. Yet here they were, both struggling to make sense of the wreckage. Downstairs, Serena stood by the kitchen counter, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of untouched coffee. She looked up as Tommy walked past her toward the door. "Tommy, wait!" she called, her voice hesitant. Tommy froze, his hand on the doorknob. "What?" he asked, his tone clipped. Serena's voice faltered. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." Tommy turned slowly, his eyes hard. "Sorry? That's it? You think saying sorry makes this better?" "I know it doesn't," Serena said, her voice trembling. "But I'm trying, Tommy. I'm trying to fix this." Tommy shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "You didn't think about fixing anything when you were sneaking around, did you? You didn't think about me or Dad." "That's not true," Serena protested, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I thought about you every single day." "Then why?" Tommy's voice cracked, his anger giving way to pain. "Why did you do it?" Serena took a step closer, her hands trembling. "I don't have a good answer. I was selfish, and I made the worst mistake of my life. But I love you, Tommy, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you." Tommy's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He opened his mouth to respond, but shook his head instead. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Serena standing alone in the kitchen. Aaron watched from the stairs, his heart breaking at the sight of Serena's collapse. She sank to the floor, her sobs echoing through the house. For the first time, Aaron saw the full extent of her guilt, not just the guilt of being caught, but the weight of what she had done to their family. He wanted to feel anger, to let it shield him from the pain, but in that moment, all he felt was exhaustion. He descended the stairs quietly, pausing in the doorway. Serena looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her expression pleading. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. "I don't even know where to start." Aaron's voice was quiet, almost defeated. "Neither do I." The words hung between them, a fragile acknowledgement of the broken pieces they both held. Whether those pieces could ever be put back together was a question neither of them had the strength to answer. The house felt quieter than ever, as if the weight of the last few days had seeped into the walls themselves. Serena sat in the living room staring at an old family photo. It was from a simpler time, Tommy's 8th birthday party. Aaron was holding the camera, laughing as Tommy smeared frosting on his mother's face. The memory hit her like a tidal wave, a stark contrast to the fractured family they'd become. She'd made an appointment with a therapist earlier that day, something she had avoided for far too long. For years, she had buried her insecurities and frustrations, hiding behind the roles of wife and mother, until the cracks could no longer be contained. Now, facing the wreckage of her choices, she was determined to confront the truths she'd ignored. Aaron walked into the room, his expression guarded but less harsh than it had been. He noticed the photo in her hands and paused. "I remember that day," he said quietly. Serena looked up, her voice hesitant. "It feels like a lifetime ago." Aaron sat down in the chair across from her, his gaze steady. "It was a good day, one of the best." Serena nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. "I let myself forget what that felt like. Being happy, being whole." Aaron didn't respond, but his silence was not as cold as before. Serena took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I made an appointment with a therapist," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know it doesn't fix anything, but I need to figure out why I let it get this far." Aaron's expression softened, though his guard was still up. "It's a start." Serena hesitated, then said, "I'm not asking you to forgive me, Aaron. I need to be better. For myself. For Tommy." Aaron leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "He's hurting," he said. "He's angry, confused. I've tried to shield him, but there's only so much I can do." Serena's tears spilled over, her voice breaking. "I hate what I've done to him, to both of you. If I could take it all back—" "But you can't," Aaron interrupted gently. "None of us can. All we can do is figure out how to move forward." They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy but less suffocating than before. Aaron stood, pausing at the doorway. "Tommy's at Caroline's. I'm picking him up soon. He might not say it, but he needs to see that you're trying." Serena nodded, wiping her tears. "I'll be here, waiting." When Aaron returned with Tommy later that evening, Serena was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Tommy walked in cautiously, his gaze flicking between his parents. The tension in his posture eased slightly when Serena greeted him with a soft smile. "Hey, bud," she said, her voice tentative but warm. "I made your favorite, mac and cheese. Thought we could sit down and eat together." Tommy hesitated, his expression skeptical. "Why now?" Serena took a shaky breath. "Because I want to try, Tommy. I want to make things right, starting with this." Aaron watched the exchange from the doorway, his heart heavy but hopeful. Tommy slowly nodded and sat at the table, his movements still guarded. Serena placed a plate in front of him, her hands trembling as she tried to act normal. As they ate, the conversation was sparse but less strained than before. Tommy asked Aaron about his day, and Serena chimed in with a story about a recipe mishap from years ago. The laughter that followed was hesitant, but it was real, a small crack of light breaking through the darkness. Later that night, as Aaron stood by the window, Serena joined him. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me a chance to be here, to try." Aaron didn't look at her, but he nodded. "This doesn't mean everything's okay, but it's a step." Serena's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were mixed with a glimmer of hope. "That's all I need." The quiet stretched between them, but it was no longer a void. It was the start of something fragile, something uncertain, but something that could grow. The cafe was quiet, the gentle hum of soft music filling the space. Serena sat at a small corner table in Whispering Beans, her hands clasped tightly around a steaming mug of tea. She glanced at the clock on the wall, then back to the entrance. Her heart thudded with each passing second, her nerves a mix of hope and fear. The bell over the door chimed and Aaron walked in. His presence still carried the weight of quiet strength that had once made her feel invincible. But now it was tinged with a cautiousness that reminded her of how far they'd fallen. He spotted her immediately, his gaze unreadable, and made his way to the table. "Hi," Serena said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Aaron nodded, sitting down across from her. "Hi." The silence between them wasn't as heavy as it once was, but it was still thick with unspoken words. Serena took a deep breath, her fingers trembling against the ceramic mug. "Thank you for coming." Aaron leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on hers. "I figured it was time." She nodded, her throat tightening. "I know I can't undo what I've done. I know things won't just go back to the way they were." "No, they won't," Aaron said evenly, though his tone lacked the sharpness it once had. "But that doesn't mean we can't figure out a way forward." Serena's breath hitched, tears pooling in her eyes. "That's all I want. A chance to rebuild, to show you and Tommy that I'm still here for this family." Aaron studied her for a moment, his expression softening slightly. "It's not just about me, Serena. It's about him too. He's hurt. Maybe more than either of us realized." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I've started therapy. I'm trying to figure out why I let things spiral the way they did. I want to be better, not just for him, but for myself." Aaron nodded slowly. "That's good. It's a start." They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation shifting from painful reflections to tentative plans for the future. For the first time in months, Serena felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile but unmistakable thread tying them together again. When they returned home, Tommy was sitting on the couch, his homework spread out on the coffee table. He looked up, his expression guarded but curious. "How was it?" he asked, his tone hesitant. Aaron glanced at Serena, then back to Tommy. "It was a step." Serena knelt in front of Tommy, her eyes level with his. "I know I've hurt you, Tommy, more than I can ever say. But I'm not giving up on us, on this family. I'm here, if you'll let me be." Tommy looked at her, his emotions flickering across his face, anger, sadness, and, finally, the faintest hint of hope. "I'm not ready to forgive you," he said honestly, "but I'm willing to try." Serena's tears fell freely, and she reached out, wrapping Tommy in a tight embrace. He hesitated for a moment before slowly hugging her back. Aaron watched from the doorway, his own emotions a mix of relief and caution. Over the next few weeks, the house began to feel different. There were still cracks, but light was starting to seep through. Serena committed herself to therapy, making small but meaningful changes that didn't go unnoticed. Aaron remained guarded, but his walls began to lower, brick by brick, and Tommy, though still wary, began to trust the slow, steady rhythm of a family trying to heal. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Aaron looked around at his wife and son. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was laughter, soft, hesitant, but real. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And in that moment, Aaron realized that while their family would never be the same, it could still be whole. Not because the past was forgotten, but because they had chosen together to move forward.